is where my dad's side of the family is from. I say originally from, but I'm like after the slave ship, you know. But yeah, I am someone who has done, I think, a lot of work personally on myself and within community around how to engage um, Black, Indigenous folks and Indigenous folks to these territories in conversations around kinship and solidarity and relationships. And I think for me it's really important. I need this to work for me to be able to exist, but I think also when I think of liberation on these lands, it's not one or the other. For me, you can't have Black liberation on lands that are still oppressed, and you can't have Indigenous liberation while Black folks are still oppressed. And I think for me, what's really important is when I'm having this conversation, the reason why in my bio it says Black diasporic Indigenous peoples is because oftentimes Black folks are completely separated or disconnected from their indigeneity in a way that has been carefully constructed by white supremacy, by Western ideals of like what people are supposed to look like and how things are supposed to be done. And it oftentimes disconnects us in a way that it doesn't need to. And so I think it's really important that when we're talking about this relationship between Black folks and Indigenous folks, it's also to acknowledge that indigeneity within Blackness. I always say that I'm someone who's triply displaced. My family was displaced from Africa to Carriacou, from Carriacou to Trinidad, and from Trinidad here. And so that is a disconnect from land that is within my own family. Also a disconnect from culture, a disconnect from language. I'm not someone here who can tell you today where in Africa my family's from, but that doesn't negate the fact that we were Indigenous people who were taken from our homelands and placed in a new place. And I always like look at Caribbean folks much like in the sense that we look at Métis folks, is that we went through a form of ethnogenesis to create this very distinct culture within the Caribbean, but that distinct culture is still in part Indigenous and still has that connection to indigeneity. We've just learned to manifest it in a new way. And so when we're talking about Black Indigenous solidarity, it's important to remember that. It's important to not disconnect Black folks from conversations around connection to land. I had a really great opportunity. Celeste is on the call. Celeste organized this event, but along with Muna to have a conversation about connection to land. And something that I had brought up in that conversation was Black folks' connection to these lands. Oftentimes we think there's a disconnect because some of us are immigrants or recently have come here. But the fact of the matter is that as someone who's the descendants of slaves and knowing that slaves were brought to these lands and were buried on these lands, I have a kinship to them, and I have a responsibility to also take care of these lands as a Black person, as a Black Indigenous person. My ancestors, regardless of whether or not I was directly related to them, are buried in these lands. And so there's that type of kinship that's created here with these lands, if we're talking in a Canadian context. When we're thinking of folks who are African American or African Canadian descent, there's also that deep connection. They have been taking care of these lands for 400 years alongside First Nation folks, alongside Métis folks, alongside Inuit folks. And so, or I should say Inuk folks. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that kinship and that taking care of land. And so when we're talking about solidarity, when we're talking about things like Wet'suwet'en, when we're talking about things like land protection, Black folks are also involved in that land protection because we have been partaking in that land protection for over 400 years in various different ways amongst various different peoples. And so, yeah, I think like for me, when I think about what solidarity looks like, it's understanding that basic kinship of indigeneity, of connection to each other. It's understanding that when we think about sacred medicines, there was an article that had gone around about how folks connect to sacred medicines. And oftentimes Black folks, when they're using things like sage, people are like, whoa, that's not for you. And we need to open up conversations even about sacred medicines. Sage is something that's used amongst various Black communities around the world. And in particular, Black communities that are now on these lands. When I think of the Gullah Geechee people in South Carolina and how they have cultivated this relationship to land and have incorporated stories and teachings from their ancestors who were slaves who were brought over and have learned to use the traditional medicines to these lands in partnership with their traditional medicines, that is also a relationship and a kinship to medicines, right? And so there's all of these different ways that we're connected to each other, that I think it's more than just, oh, I happen to know a Black person, or I'm related to a Black person, or there's someone who's Afro-Indigenous on my res. There's that kinship that goes beyond just that, of just simply knowing somebody, of having a Black person in your class, of having a Black teacher. There's a deep kinship underneath that, that unfortunately Indigenous folks to these lands and Black Indigenous folks to other lands have been disconnected from. And so we have to remember that when we're having these conversations. Kinship is something that I think is really important and something that continuously needs to be reconnected to. And I think it's also important to remember that solidarity on these lands is not something new between Black, Indigenous folks and Indigenous folks to these territories. This is something that's been happening since the moment we touched on these lands. Matthew DaCosta, if anyone's ever heard of him, is Canada's favorite Black token person to bring out during Black History Month. He is supposedly the first Black person to touch foot on these lands. Some folks like to say that he was free. If you actually learn his history, he wasn't very much free. Matthew DaCosta was someone who was imprisoned, had signed a contract. That contract was passed over to somebody else. He was not someone who was free on these lands. However, he's someone who had a deep relationship with Mi'kmaq people and with Indigenous people on these territories, and was able to learn languages as an interpreter. And so we have to acknowledge that relationship that happened, that first started. This was someone who was oppressed, coming here and trying to create a relationship and a kinship with the people of these lands. And then when we start looking more and more as Black folks start being forcibly brought to these lands, that relationship started to deepen. Those conversations started to deepen. Those interconnectedness started to deepen. And so we like to talk a lot about the famous five, which are the 5 nations that own slaves, the Cherokee being the biggest one. So for folks that don't know, they have this thing called the Freedmen List. The Freedmen List is are the descendants of slaves who were owned by the Cherokee Nation. A lot of these folks have mixed, are Afro-Indigenous themselves. And so we talk about that a lot, but we don't talk about the other nations who had relationships with with Black Indigenous folks on these lands, right? We don't talk about the Tuscarora Nation, for instance. There's like this running joke that I always hear amongst Haudenosaunee folks about how dark Tuscarora folks are. And that a lot of times is connected to the fact that they had incorporated so many runaway slaves into their nation to hide them, to give them names, to give them clans, to give them family, in a way that has altered the community altogether. My friend Sam Makwa, who's hilarious, talks about how in his community of Matagami, that Wagwan has become such an integral part of their language that folks now use it to say hello, which is hilarious. But when you think about the fact that Afro-Indigenous folks are making their ways into communities, that we're altering the ways in which we even say hello in our Indigenous languages. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge that. During Wounded Knee in the 70s, Angela Davis actually showed up to Wounded Knee as a Black Panther to show her support for the American Indian movement. These forms of solidarity, these forms of showing up for each other have continuously happened on these lands. Now, that's not to negate the fact that there is anti-Blackness in the Indigenous community. I'm sure we've all heard it. There's been a really big conversation amongst Anishinaabe folks around the way in which we refer to Black people. So Makade Wias is a term that's been commonly used to refer to Black people. Makade meaning Black, Wias meaning meat. And so there's been this like conversation about when we're referring to Black folks in our languages, does it something that makes sense in English? And if it doesn't, how do we help our language to reflect the time that we're in? I think it's really important to talk about, when we're talking about things like language, our Indigenous communities have never been and will never be stagnant. We are continuously changing. Our language is continuously changing. The way in which we refer to each other is continuously changing. And so when we're having conversations with Black folks and they're saying, hey, I actually don't appreciate the way in which your word for me, what it means in English, let's have a conversation about how we can change that. Let's have a conversation about the ways in which we relate to each other. It's very much like when we ask folks not to refer to us as Indian. It's very much as when we refer folks to not refer to us as squaw, as Indigenous women, right? It's really important that while we're asking others to change the way in which they refer to us, that we're also doing that work inside of our own communities, right? And that's not like a pushback to say that we have to change, that we can't continue to be Anishinaabe people or Haudenosaunee people or Mi'kmaq people. It's just simply saying, hey, how do we refer to each other in a way that actually connects us, that actually honors that kinship in a healthy way? And so these conversations are happening all over, and we're hearing it a lot. And I think when we're talking about solidarity, yes, protests are important. Showing up is important. Being there to stand by Black people is important. But we need to talk about how we're doing it in other ways other than just protests. I think I can speak for a lot of Black folks. I'm not interested in you showing up to protest if you're not doing the work at home. At the end of the day, you spending an hour out on the street with me is not going to fix whether or not I can walk onto your reserve, whether or not I can speak to your elders. I had like a really good friend. She was like showing up for me in all the ways I needed her to at school. But when it came to her family, she was very honest about the fact that they still use the N-word. She was very honest about the fact that the way that if she had brought home a Black man, how they would have responded. And for me, it was like, I'm really great that you're helping make it safer for me at school, but I know Afro Indigenous kids from your res. And how is it safer for them to be at home? How is it safer for them to be in community? We oftentimes talk a lot about, kids that are mixed with like Mohawk and white or Anishinaabe and white, and how do they navigate spaces? But very rarely do we talk about how do Afro Indigenous kids connect. I can say, as someone who faced a lot of anti-Blackness in the Indigenous community, I stayed away from community for a year. I didn't attend ceremonies. I didn't go to events. I didn't go to spaces. And my mental health took such a decline that I was scared for myself because I had disconnected myself from community so much. And I'm a grown adult. That's something that I was able to navigate, but it makes me think about the young children that are growing up in our communities, on our reses, in Toronto, downtown, wherever other Indigenous folks are. How are they able to navigate those spaces? How are they able to have conversations? Right? So it's thinking about that. It's thinking about, is your ceremony safe? I think even as Anishinaabe people, when we start talking about the medicine wheel, right? We've all heard those elders that start relating it to race, where we're like, that's a little problematic, right? We're like, ooh. When we're talking about that, how do we talk to our elders? When we're talking about the medicine wheel, how do we explain to them saying, oh, well, if someone has a Black parent, then they must be Bear Clan because the Black represents strong, right? Those are things that we actually have to work with our elders. And I think it's really important about that too, is oftentimes, I think because we've bought into the narrative that Western society has given us, is that we're not allowed to teach our elders. And that's not true. I think for a lot of Indigenous communities, you'll hear elders say, I am always learning. I am not an expert. I am constantly in a mode of learning. Right. And so that means that you have the opportunity to teach your elders, that you have an opportunity to have a conversation with them about their own anti-Blackness. And we know that this has manifested within residential schools. We know where it comes from. We know the fact is that in residential schools, while white supremacists were teaching Native folks to hate their skin, that they were teaching them to also hate Black people. And so we have to acknowledge that. And we can't leave our elders out of the conversation. We can't leave them out of the learning. And we can't leave them out of being held accountable for their anti-Blackness. And so that's where I think solidarity for me looks like. It's remembering kinship. It's having the hard conversations when we need to have them. I can't see everyone's faces right now, but I know a lot of folks didn't learn Black History Month on their res. It's not something that was taught. And so I think it's confronting that. It's saying, hey, if you have access to the school system on your res during February, hey, can I come in? Can we have a conversation? Can we invite a Black person in to talk about solidarity or about our shared kinship or about community? Can we have conversations about this? What does that look like? What does it look like about us coming together and learning each other's shared histories? This is something that we all can do, that we can all take the time to do. I think, once again, when we're talking about each other, when we're talking about Black issues, something that's really come up right now when we're talking about, Black Lives Matter, oftentimes folks are like, well, Native folks are being killed here too. Native folks are dying at the hands of police. So what are we supposed to do? And I think it's important to acknowledge that we can have both conversations, that one doesn't need to step over the other. that when we have a recent death of a young Indigenous woman, you're allowed to bring that up. You're allowed to say that. You're allowed to honor her life. I think where we start to get into these messy things is where we're seeing posts like, well, you marched for Black people yesterday, so why can't you march for us today? That is when we're starting to get into these conversations of oppression Olympics. This is where we're starting to use each other's movements as a way to shame folks, right? And that's not something that we should be doing as folks who are kin. That's not something we should be doing as folks who are constantly facing this violence, right? It's not about, well, you showed up for them, why can't you show up for me? That's not the conversation that we should be having, right? That's not what we do. It's, hey, show up for me, period. Show up for me, period. I think if y'all want to compare it to the climate march, by all means, go ahead. I am too confused as to why so much folks were at the climate march, but not at Black Lives Matter rallies or marches or protests. I'm confused as to why so much folks were at the climate march, but didn't show up for Wet'suwet'en. I'm confused as to why the women's march is so packed, but none of them show up for any of our stuff. I too am confused. And I think those are the things that we can talk about. Those are the things that we can bring up. Right? I want to know why y'all are so outraged about a dog dying, but not a human being. Those are the conversations that we can have about the ways in which others show up for us. But it can't be in a way in which where we're tearing the other movement down. It can't be in a way in which where we're silencing others while having this conversation. I think it's also important to remember the ways in which a lot of our stories are being highlighted, right? There's an article, and I can't remember the name of it. I will share it with A7G so they can share with folks later. But this journalist had talked about the fact that the reason why we see so much around Black death is because the hyper visualization of Black people, right? That society needs to paint Black people as other. Look at how bad they are. Look at how they're reacting to their pain. Look at how they're not going to school. Look at all of these things. Look at all of the crime that they're doing, right? They have to, Black folks have to be hyper visualized as the bad, as the not good. And so that's why there's all of these highlights around Black death by white people, is because it's very easy to position us as the evil, as the not good, as the not the model minority. And then when we're looking at Indigenous folks to these lands have to be erased in order for these colonial societies to continue to exist, right? As much as Canada wants to acknowledge the harm that they've done, and the US, the harm that they've done, they never do it in concrete ways. Because if they actually had to admit the full-on genocide that they committed on these lands, then they would have to acknowledge that they are illegal colonial states. And that's not something they're willing to do. So they don't want to highlight Indigenous death on these lands. They don't want to highlight Indigenous pain on these lands, because then they have to continue to acknowledge the genocide that is continuing to go on. And so I think it's important to remember that when we're saying, well, why is one being seen and why not the other? That's not the fault of each other's movements. That's the fault of white supremacy trying to pin us in very parallel different places to say, hey, look at how evil these are, but don't look at these people, right? Because they can't exist. They can't continue to exist. And so it's important to remember that it isn't about Black folks, taking away from the pain and the suffering that Indigenous folks on these lands are facing. And it's not about Indigenous folks not caring about the pain that Black folks are facing on these lands. It's about the ways in which they are positioned within media, within society, right? And so we can show up for each other. We can do those things. We don't have to buy into the stories that the government, that society continues to tell us, right? When I think of Black death on these lands, that is also an Indigenous issue. When I think of Indigenous death on these lands, that is a Black issue. The two are not separate, right? It might manifest in different ways, but it is not separate. I don't know if folks have recently watched the documentary that was on Crave on the missing and murdered Black children in Atlanta. And I watched it and I couldn't help but think, how many Indigenous children have I heard of in the same way? How many Indigenous children and women have gone missing and their families are blamed by the police as to why they're missing, in the same way that manifested with Black children in Atlanta? So we're having paralleled experiences. We're having things that we're going through. When we talk about children in the foster care system, I know that 47% of children in the foster care system in Toronto are Black. I recognize that the majority of the children in the foster care system in the country are Indigenous. And we can acknowledge that, and we can talk about those parallels, and we can come together and work on that. When we talk about defunding the police, right? And supporting each other around that. There's this really amazing community in Chiron, Mexico, an Indigenous community who defunded the police back in 2011. They got rid of their police altogether. They got rid of their colonial politicians altogether and decided to implement community-based Indigenous forms of care. I don't want to say policing because it's actually care, right? And that's something that we can replicate in communities here that are predominantly Black or predominantly Indigenous or a mix of both, right? There's so many ways in which we can imply how we're doing things in our individual communities with each other. When we talk about restorative justice, that's not just something to Indigenous people on these lands. Restorative justice is something that's amongst Black communities, Black Indigenous communities around the world. These are the ways in which we can have these conversations, right? And it starts with a conversation. It starts with a conversation with yourself, with your friends, with your families. I think it's also really important to remember that we all can perpetuate anti-Blackness. We all can do it, right? And so it's finding ways to not do that, to unlearn that. This world that we live in is inherently anti-Black. So from the moment you were born, you were taught to be anti-Black, regardless of whether or not you want to be, regardless of whether or not you love Black people in your life. We are all inherently anti-Black, and we are all learning to unpack that. And so it's not to get defensive when someone calls you out on something. When you make a post and a Black person says, hey, whoa, that actually hurts me and it's anti-Black, your first response shouldn't be to be defensive or to be like, whoa, well, this is what's happening to Native folks. It's simply to say, okay, I recognize your pain. How do I do better? How do we move forward? What can I do to support you? Right? When you're asking Black folks or Afro-Indigenous folks for support on things, it's also remembering to pay them. And when I say pay them, I don't always mean in monetary ways. Yes, monetary ways is how we have to function in today's capitalistic society, but we as Indigenous people know that there's other ways to honor people's efforts, to honor people's labor. Right? Something that's been really great that I've been receiving from a lot of my other Indigenous friends is them asking, can they send me medicines? How are the ways in which they can support me that aren't just monetary, right? And so it's having conversations around that. It's having conversations around, how do I honor your labor in a way that respects our kinship, that respects our relationship, that respects each other, right? I understand a lot of us are dealing with poverty. A lot of us are dealing with unemployment. So if you want to learn from a Black person, help paint them a painting. Show them that you're honoring the labor that they've just done for you, right? And so I'm going to end it there, but I think it's just really important for us that while we're talking about solidarity, to always keep in mind that kinship, that base of us being Indigenous peoples, whether we are displaced or not, and recognizing that we are in this together in various different ways, but at the end of the day, together. So, chimigwech.
Miigwech Shanice, hi, Debwe, Tapwe. I wanted to share that, I think a lot of what you're talking about is really decentering whiteness, and it creeps in, and it's so gross, and it's just, it takes a lot of energy and being conscious about it, but we all need to unpack that. Yeah, and unfortunately it even creeped into our language, right? And so I wanted to share an appropriate way that some language speakers say Black Lives Matter. So they say it's makade madiziwanan kiche piten dagadon. And so the way that we actually because we do a language drop-in every Wednesday, so we actually like to break down the language and what it actually means, because English is so simplified, but what it actually means is Black lives, Madiziwanan is kind of refers to people walking, your fellows, like people walking in the same way. And then P10, Kichip P10, it means are very, very precious. Because in Anishinaabe, when all life matters, even down to the littlest ant, all life matters. And so it's almost implied in Anishinaabe that all life matters, but they really wanted to put an emphasis that Black lives are very precious. So I wanted to, you just reminded me of that. Miigwech. So we're gonna go on to our next speaker, Sharon. And so I've known Sharon for quite a while. And me and Sharon even went to Rwanda together. And we kind of went with this, it was awkward. We kind of were there in a bit of like a white savior kind of organization. And yeah, Sharon, we would have a lot of moments where we just look at each other and be like, I'm gonna head out. And so there was this one time when they put us, like, Indigenous folks, into the Canadian caucus. And so we were like, we're not part of a Canadian caucus. Like, I had to constantly tell them that. And they're like, oh, we're gonna do like a showcase, because there was youth from like all over the world. They were all gonna do like cultural showcases. And they're like, we're gonna do a Canadian showcase, and so you guys can be in it. And I was like, I don't think I'm gonna do that. So I just went to like their kind of like rehearsal just to like say that I showed up. And then when I showed up, they had like an iPad that had like a fake fire on it. And it was in the middle. And then someone had a guitar. And then they were practicing to sing Bare Naked Ladies, If I Had $1,000,000. And I was like, me and Sharon just like looked at each other and started laughing. And I was like, I'm gonna leave now. So anyways, that's like, that's me and Sharon's experiences, some of them. But I'm gonna pull up Sharon's bio. All right. Okay, Sharon Nyangweso is a digital communications and inclusion consultant specializing in digital experiences and moving visions of inclusivity from aspiration to action. An immigrant from Kenya who has lived and worked in Ottawa for 9 years, Sharon has worked with youth and organizations in 11 countries, is a community organizer, and has sat on the board of directors for Ottawa-based social justice nonprofit Inter Pares, Refugee 613, and Amethyst Women's Addiction Center. But before you take it away, Sharon, I wanted everyone to know that we actually have some folks that are scraping some hides. I don't know if you could check, I don't know if you could see them, but it's so cool. I love that. And I'm just gonna switch the spotlight onto Sharon now. So Miigwech, hi, thanks for being with us, and feel free to take it away.
Thanks, Gabby, and thanks everyone. I know I write my bio, but it's always embarrassing to hear it. I'm not sure who else comes from communities where you're not supposed to be out here talking about yourself and your work, but it's always real awkward. Thank you so much. I almost feel like we should just end the conversation after Shanice, because I'm out here needing to like stare in the distance and think about my entire life after that sermon she just gave. So I'll start by saying I'm so happy to be here, and also that I think speaking after Shanice will be a really good opportunity to also focus on the fact that, like First Nation folks, I think Black folks in this country have so many different experiences and so many interruptions into the way we lived our lives and the way we know our histories and our past and our ancestors, that informs the way we now move around and even the way we engage with each other. So I am from Kenya. I am from the Luya community. We are, I have a tattoo on me just to remind me, but we are known as leopards, and we don't have clan names, but our community in the feminine, as I am, is Namulanda, and that means those who wander or those who travel, which is fitting because here I am wandering and traveling. And these are things that I spent a lot of my childhood and some of my formative years in Kenya, but this is information that was incredibly new to me. And it was new to me because I think for a lot of the continent, for my part of the continent, our histories are so fraught with violence and fraught with I think I don't know what the right word for it, but other like a false sense of independence and a false sense of liberation, which means that although we remain on the lands that are ancestrally ours, and although we self-govern ourselves, a lot of that is not actually quite as straightforward as it looks. And that means that we carry around with us a lot of unchecked baggage and a lot of unchecked trauma that we bring across every boundary we enter. I don't know if we have folks here who are immigrants or have family who's immigrated from Africa, but it is it is a terrible, terrible thing, and it is difficult for us to navigate the world with. But what I find it is even worse is when we come into places like what we call Canada. This is something that even Gabby and I have talked about in multiple times. But I find myself doing a lot of checking of immigrants from Africa, because we come into the space with, and like Shani says, the disappearance of Indigenous folks is excellently done, not just here on this continent, but across the world, because a lot of us come to this land not knowing, not like we know this land as white land. That's how we're taught it. That, I mean, our history isn't taught well, so you can imagine the type of history we're getting from outside. And it is a fraught experience because, and this is something I've talked about, multiple times. When we come, like myself, when I came to Canada, the permission I got to be here, the access I got when I came here was from a colonial state. And there comes a moment in your immigrant experience, if you've had the privilege to be taught by someone, there comes a moment when your existence here is so heavy, because you are not sure how to then navigate the fact that you know the colonial experience so intimately. I feel like a lot of people, we speak about former colonial states like Kenya, where I'm from, as we got our independence, but actually, like, my dad was born under colonial rule, so it's not that history is not that far away. So we are coming with our own baggage, and then we don't know how to navigate here, and we don't know how to navigate the fact now that, like, we literally have, like, in a way, like, recolonized ourselves by being here. For whatever reason, we've come here, and by virtue of trying to be the best version, and like Shanice, you talked about placing Blackness as kind of like the least desirable. We're like placed on a spectrum, and Blackness is the least desirable. But when you come into the country, they give you a cheat code. They're like, if you want to, like, be the less desirable, but just a little bit less, remember, the people you need to shit on constantly is Indigenous people. And you're given this message in overt and covert ways. And so, when we talk about the different types of kinship and the different experiences between Black folks and Indigenous folks, I think, it goes both ways. That learning, that unlearning, that time and that care, it goes both ways, because we truly, it's honestly, it sucks, but the ways in which we are given tools to survive are inherently built with, like, a lot of hate and discrimination, and trying to distance ourselves from each other as much as possible, just because that is how we survive. And that is even within ourselves. Like, I don't know if for folks who've been in Black spaces, like, even with immigrants, there's a way in which we are taught to distance ourselves from Black folks who have ancestors who were forcefully brought here. Like, it is literally how we're just told, these are your methods of survival. And that is something that, for the most part, I think some of our elders go their entire lives without even having to think through. And so I think that message of, like, bringing in your elders, your parents, your grandparents into that fold, and understanding that we we have there is inherent value in our allyship and our kinship, because we know we know how to care for ourselves, we know how to care for our lands, we know how to care for our people. I mean, I think of even right now the conversations happening about COVID-19. Literally, there was a point in the conversation where they were like, why aren't Africans dying? Like, we need an explanation. Tell us why they're not dying, because this is not part of the plan. Africans are supposed to die, and we're not comfortable with the fact that Black death is not on display. But I mean, I guess I got it at the end of the day. But even thinking about the way, like, again, Shanice, you're talking about Black death being on display. I do think even in this moment, again, this is so much an opportunity. I feel like I'm piggybacking on this for us to not just talk about ideas of our kinship, but create the solid mechanisms and the structures that make it so that Black children, First Nations children, Indigenous children, the day they come into this world, they come into this world knowing that my kin look like this, and this is how we celebrate with them, this is how we care for them. Like, we need to build that in as like these hardcore structures that just are unmovable by whiteness, are uninformed by whiteness. Because Gabby and I, when you asked me to join, one of the things I was telling you that I'm thinking a lot about in this moment, there's so much grief, so much pain, and it's difficult because I work in this space. So I constantly have to remind myself that I have expertise in a certain kind of work, but white people don't, even if they're paying me for my work, they're not paying me for my pain, and they're not paying me for me to perform my pain. So I need to be very careful about these things. But it is something that I've been thinking so deeply about in this moment. I think in Canada specifically, I don't want to speak on the American context, but in Canada specifically, it has been so easy to see white folks take up arms, Black Lives Matter, post the Black Square, in a way that it hasn't been for them to talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women, or just like the Indigenous struggle in general. And I think it has been easy for them because they really distance themselves from Black oppression in this country, and anti-Black racism in this country. But also, I think another cheat code they've given themselves is that when you're talking about Black oppression and anti-Black racism and Black liberation in this country, you're not having a conversation about land. And I think that's what allows them to step up so loudly, is because they know if they're talking about Indigenous folks, then they have to then talk about how to give away land. And that, they get to pick and choose what's more comfortable. And so that allyship is so necessary for us, so that, there's never a moment of comfort. When they are talking about our pain, when we are talking about our allyship, there is never a moment of comfort for the people so when people do show up outside of, people who aren't Black and Indigenous, when they do show up and they're saying, now it's time for me to be an ally, we need to make them understand that this is we're not a one trick pony here. And if you're showing up for one of us, you're showing up for all of us. And much like I do in my work, I refuse to do diversity and inclusion training. I refuse to do unconscious bias training, that kind of work when I do my work, because to me, it's like, okay, if you are here, we then need to start talking about the structures of your organization, the structures of your homes, the structures of everything you do, because that is where our concern. I have to apologize. I feel like I'm getting emotional right now, mostly because I was mentioning this earlier. I'm not an emotional person, but I feel like especially because in the moment we're living in where we cannot physically be together, I feel like there have been very few places for us to collectively grieve and to collectively feel our pain. And so this is as much important as it is therapeutic. But all of this to say, when I first came here as an adult, and when I first started learning what Canada's actual history was, when I started learning who were the stewards of this land, I had this moment of reckoning where it felt very strange to me. Like, we didn't have those solid structures of kinship and allyship. We didn't like, it seemed so natural because we all know the colonial experience, but also we all know, like Shanice is saying, this like intense relationship to the land. I come from a family where we have three different very experiences within my one family. The people that I come from on both my parents' side, we have a portion of the family who were so distrustful of colonialism that they try to keep knowledge of medicines and the things that we worshipped, and those are things that even now I have to struggle to get access to because they were so wiped away. And that part of our family is incredibly, like, lives in incredible levels of poverty. And then another side of my family that like jump headfast into colonialism in a way of survival. And we know these experiences, although our land, the deed of our land is in our name, it never is to date. We're still passed around. We're, you know, whether it's China, we're still passed around. And so we know that experience so intimately. And when we come here, for whatever reason, for safety, for whatever, when we come here, it feels like we need to now be embracing each other in this, like, you know, I found my people, and now this is an opportunity for us to like to do the things we need to do to be healthy and happy and liberated. And I don't know what that looks like. I remember years ago, I was talking to Gabby because I'm like, I feel like I want to do this. I want to, almost in a way, I think I called it recrossing. I almost want to recross the boundary. I almost want to re-enter the border to Canada, but with the rightful, like with the right people in the room, and not, you know, IRCC or whatever they call it, Immigration Canada. Like, I want to do that recrossing. And I feel like for a lot of folks who come into this country, especially the older ones, they never know, they never learn, and they need that moment to be like, this is our shared experience, this is our shared history, these are the things that we love, that value for land you have, that medicine you give me so that I don't have cramps, this is our shared knowledge, this is our shared love language, and we need a moment to make that happen. And so I'm still thinking on it. I need time, but I am, unfortunately or fortunately for myself, I am the kind of person who like refuses to talk for too long. I just want just to do a thing. So, you know, you never know. I might be calling you to be like, we need to recross. Where do we do this? How do we do this? Give me the right papers. I need to redo my immigration process. But yeah, I'll stop there because I might just start weeping at this moment. So let me hand it over to someone else. Thank you.
Me got Sharon. Yeah, I remember when you're talking about that, kind of like this idea that new relationships between nations have to be created, new tribal relations. And we, you know, it's no secret, treaties and some of those prior negotiations have not been honored. And so what does that look like for the future? Is it new? I don't know. It's just something different, right? And I think like just being open to looking at what that might be, having an open mind and being hopeful, that's like a great way forward. But I'm so hopeful too, you know, and we're still here, it's talking, and we're progressing, I think, in the right direction. So, you know, it's good signs. Yeah, I think that's another reason we wanted to kind of create this place, because I know like a lot of us have been like sharing on Twitter and like other social media, but it's so different when you're actually talking to folks. So I'm happy you're getting emotional and having you feel like you're in a safe place to do that. So next, we're gonna move on to Muna. I'm pulling up everyone's professional bios. All right. So I'm going to introduce Muna, and then I'm going to share a few words about Muna. So Muna Mohammed is a Black woman convening and mobilizing on unceded Algonquin territory. She has experience in youth engagement, grassroots social change, Black Indigenous solidarity work, and anti-oppressive convening. Muna's work in the community has been focusing on anti-policing advocacy in Ottawa since the murder of Abdi Rahman Abdi, a Somali man murdered by Ottawa police officer Daniel Montsion in 2016. In her work, she is passionate and focused on exploring how to design community gatherings in a way that fosters safety and vulnerable learnings in cross-cultural and anti-racist dialogue. Muna is the daughter of Garaje. Did I say it? Is it?
Gurage.
Gurage, okay. Gurage Ethiopian immigrants to Turtle Island, and is rooted in her commitment to her family, community, and her ancestral maternal lineage. Sumikwa, Chai Hai, thanks for being with us, Muna. I feel like you're always with us. You've like just been adopted into Indigenous communities in Ottawa and Winnipeg, and probably other communities that I don't know about. But I think a really important part about building relationships is showing up, and you definitely show up. And you know, we really appreciate that. And like Shanice was talking about, it's not about giving money, you know, like that's one way you can show up, but like literally being in a circle, literally just laughing with folks, just sharing food together. Food is so important. We had a barbecue last night and I'm still thinking about it. But yeah, so thanks so much for being with us, and yeah, feel free to take it away.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I feel like, so I worked for a year with this phenomenal movement called the 4Rs Youth Movement. And a few folks from the 4Rs are on this chat right now. I know Danny, and I think I saw Ronald in here earlier, and they've become family to me. But I know that before the 4Rs, and the reason that my experience with the 4Rs was so difficult was because before that I felt like I was practicing performative solidarity. Like I was doing the work of, especially after the death of Abdurrahman Abdi, like the only times I would engage elders and community members, and this is a point of vulnerability for me, like I'm sharing, I think, a learning and a growth, but the only time I did this work of engaging or connecting with the Indigenous community in Ottawa was when we needed folks to open up space for us. And I remember entering the 4Rs and feeling like so much of my history of doing this work has been so extractive. And so I entered into this space and embarked on this journey of like a lot of humility and learning and growth. And I think just what you named, Gabby, like just deepening those relationships with folks that I've met through the network, you know, and people who I consider like family at this point, has been so powerful. And I think a core principle that I carry with me in this work has been reciprocity. And so even when I think about this conversation, I think about, as someone who's an anti-racism educator, how much people want to extract from us in this time, like how, you know, Black folks die, it's very visible. And suddenly all these organizations who the last time I heard from them was when Abdurrahman died, suddenly want training again, because it feels like the one thing that they can do to absolve themselves of guilt, is honestly what it feels like. And so I think about, even because Gabby, you said something really powerful earlier about decentering whiteness. To me, my practice of decentering whiteness is when things like this happen, I zone in on supporting my community, and to me that's Black folks. And then when I think about like the labor I put into educating or providing my knowledge outside of that, I think Indigenous next, POC next, and then we'll start talking about white folks. Because to me, I think we really also have to think about the ways that we intentionally put this labor of ours, because this is a gift. I think what folks are offering on this call, and everyone who showed up to listen, like this exchange is so precious. And I think that we need to put more energy and dedicate more of ourselves to that, instead of centering whiteness all the time. And I think our centering of whiteness is also, unfortunately, I think is really built into the ways that we understand change as only being reform. So it's really hard to decenter whiteness when white folks are like the top, like hold all the power when it comes to institutions. And so we put all of our labor in like, what does allyship look like for white people? How do we change our messaging so white people understand it better? We start to dilute our experiences and the power of our ancestry and our history, which I think Shanice talked about really beautifully. We dilute that so that it's understandable and so that it fits within a language or a package that white people understand. And I think what's beautiful about reframing, like away from, we need to work within institutions, we need to fight for this funding, because that's so scarcity mindset. That's like a very scarce mindset. You're thinking about, there's only a pool of funding that we can have. we need it, so we'll fight for it. Instead of focusing on that institutional change, when we rethink what a powerful future for Black and Indigenous peoples looks like on Turtle Island, and we think about liberation and we think about designing that together, that then refocuses our energy on each other. And I think that's like the shift that I wish for us. The shift that I wish for us is that we're thinking about our energy and thinking about dreaming together, and like worrying about white folks later. Like that's not what our job is right now. Our job is to actually focus on each other. So I just wanted to say that because I think, yeah, what Gabby, you named about decentering whiteness. And then I also just think like the importance of centering the voices of Afro-Indigenous folks who, you know, from my perspective, I feel like I can speak to the ways that I've come into this work and learned, but when it's someone's experience and when our solidarity is actually deeply connected to people's livelihoods, and the livelihoods and of Afro-Indigenous folks, like that I think is really important. So I'm really glad that Shanice, you started us off in conversation and dialogue together. For myself, so I'm an Ethiopian second gen, so I really deeply identify with the terminology of being a child of the African diaspora. My you know, ancestral like lineage or my people, I have the privilege, and I say this truly and deeply, I have the privilege to know where my people are from as a Black person. We're from the kind of southern region of Ethiopia, and we're the Gurage people. So both my mom and my dad are Gurage. I also have the privilege of being raised by my grandmother. So really understanding, I think the aspects of, because I'm Muslim, really understanding the aspects of my spirituality that have been carried through my ancestral lineage. And some of those practices are like dream interpretation is something that my family and my maternal lineage carry and do, and something that I'm trying to learn to practice. And when I think of who my people are, because I feel like this is a convoluted question sometimes too, but when I think of who my people are, I think of the children of Black immigrants. I think my people are Black people on Turtle Island. And when I know and believe that, I also know and believe that that we're not a monolith, as Sharon was sharing. We're so complex and different and unique in our experiences, and also unique in the forms of oppression that we face. When I think of especially being the child of immigrants, I think it's important for us to understand specifically what is the strategy of colonialism and anti-Blackness. The strategy has been, when it comes to citizenship and immigration, there needs, like, the Canadian state needs to fabricate this idea that Canada is a safe haven in order for it to thrive. And for us to maintain the colonial state as a structure. And so I say this because when I think of what it means to practice solidarity work, I often think about it within our spheres of influence. And one of those spheres, and a few folks have talked about this already, but one of those spheres of influence is our families. And I've started to go into spaces and thinking, like, is this knowledge I can carry back to my grandmother? Is this knowledge I can carry back into conversations with my family? And what I noticed deeply, and Sharon spoke about this as well, is that what we're actually working, or what we're up against when we're the children of immigrants, is we're up against this idea that that Canada is safe and is a place that has been accepting and that has been welcoming and that has been gracious and giving to all POC. And so we actually are doing this work of like breaking down what that means and really like restructuring the core beliefs that our family has. And that to me is lifelong work that I think I've committed to in my life. And that also, like, this is deeply held institutional beliefs. Like I remember going to my grandmother's citizenship ceremony, and it's embedded in like citizenship oaths. This belief that Canada is a safe haven is something that's needed to uphold this state. And similarly, I mean, this is something that my friend Rosie has shared with me. I think it was like a talk that she had in 2016. Similarly, the erasure of anti-Blackness as a problem in this country is needed for this country to continue to survive, right? And for our colonial state to continue to survive. And so Rosie has this quote, I'm not sure where she got it from, but where she says the US practices anti-Blackness as if it's like stabbing you, but Canada practices anti-Blackness like a scalpel, so it's cutting you open slowly. It's not this act that is seen and is as visible to us, but it's just as harmful and it cuts just as deep. And I think it's important for us to speak about that, especially in the context of what I'm seeing right now, because I think the ways that I've sometimes noticed Indigenous communities enacting anti-Blackness or violence is in that continued erasure of what anti-Blackness looks like on these lands. And a way that I've seen that actually, and I think this is, I mean, I've noticed it in the ways that we talked about the Prime Minister kneeling at the march this past Friday, which was absolute bullshit. But that moment where the Prime Minister kneeled and we were having all these conversations at the local, like the municipal level and the provincial level about anti-Blackness in our policing. And then I think because it's possible that there wasn't an understanding of how anti-Blackness plays out at the federal level. I feel like there was a conflation of that conversation in terms of the ways that the Prime Minister has enacted violence on Indigenous communities. And I think that that's okay. Like as Shanice named, I think we need to create and continue to create space to talk about how anti-racism has, or how racism has played out for Indigenous, Black, and POC communities at the federal level. But it left me feeling like, do we not actually know or understand how that's played out for Black folks as well? And so there are a number of ways, right? Like anti-Black racism at the federal level lives in our citizenship and immigration. It also lives in our carceral state and in our criminal code. And the federal government has jurisdiction over those decisions. And so when I think of how anti-Black racism has played out federally, it played out in the case of Abdul Abdi, who was a man who was going to be deported to Somalia. In Halifax, there was a case that followed him, and we were fighting for the engagement of Ahmed Hussein, who was the Somali man who was the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration, who also showed up to the rally. We were fighting for the attention of Justin Trudeau, who was silent the entire time that folks were advocating to stop that deportation. When I think of how anti-Black racism has played out on our national stage, it's also played out in, the government really giving a small amount of money to push this anti-racism strategy, which has mostly gone to the structuring of a department or a secretariat within the government. And community actually hasn't seen that money in any way. And this was recently announced, like Trudeau just announced that anti-Black racism was a problem a few years ago. When I think of how anti-Black racism plays out federally, I also think about how, we were able to pass this thing around legalizing marijuana, yet so many Black folks are still locked up for nonviolent crimes and for the possession and for selling marijuana. And so he had the opportunity to really create this transformative change that could have supported a movement of abolition. And he made the choice not to, while putting a lot of energy into this legislation around legalizing pot. So I think that there are these powerful ways that we need to actually center and really think about how anti-Blackness plays out. And because erasure has been a tool of the state, and because erasure has been a tool of the Canadian state for so many years, when we erase the stories of each other, it's an enactment of violence. And I think we actually have to really center and take seriously what it means for us to understand, how has anti-Blackness really showed up in our lives, but how has anti-Blackness showed up, historically in this country. And it's only through that knowledge and through that awareness that I think we can really start this allyship work. And what I feel really grateful for is the number of Black writers, the number of Black historians, like I'm sure a lot of folks have heard of Robin Maynard, that have put so much labor into making sure that our stories aren't erased. Yet sometimes because we can't find them, or because we struggle to, or I think also because we're socialized not to care about them, we uphold that and we don't put in the work and the labor of really understanding what anti-Blackness has looked like here. And so I think it's ridiculous to wait for the government to do that for us. And I think we have to commit to doing that with each other. And that's a real way that I feel like Indigenous folks can practice allyship. It's by listening and learning and understanding that deep-rooted history. Like the history really matters here, just as much as the resiliency does, that history of anti-Blackness that's continuing to be erased matters as well. The other thing I wanted to share is the 4Rs has this model for cross-cultural dialogue. And the beginning of that model recognizes that, you know, we're existing or we're entering into relationship on uneven ground. And so there's a repair and an understanding of our history that needs to happen before we can enter into healthy relationship with each other. And so this idea that we can just practice solidarity, that we can just be in relationship without the unveiling of that history is false. That showed up for me in a number of ways. I mean, I even think about like because I believe deeply in the work of critical self-reflection as like a practice of allyship, that a lot of this work is about going inwards and thinking about how you have enacted violence, the things about your identity that you've internalized, and the ways to move forward. And I think until we're able to sit with that or be in conversation with others about it, which to me really centers the eradication of shame in our dialogue, until we're able to do that, I don't think we'll be able to enter into a relationship with one another. I think someone's unmuted. I don't know who. Oh, okay. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about that entering of relationship on uneven ground. I remember when I just started at 4Rs, we went to Nimki, I think our first week together as a team. And I remember, like, because I'm come from a family that, you know, left Ethiopia because of political unrest, and came here, and, you know, that relationship to land wasn't something that my family ever discussed with me. I remember how difficult Nimki was. Like, I remember just like disconnecting, and it makes me emotional now, but disconnecting entirely emotionally from that, just feeling so distant, feeling so like I was dissociating in a way that I couldn't really comprehend. And I was telling Danny and Ron that it was only like a year later that I actually deeply started to understand like what it meant for me to be in a space like that as a Black person who's from a family that's been pulled from their community, and who has, I think, deeply internalized that relationship to land as something that can't be had because it's unsafe to have it, and because developing that relationship, it can be pulled away from you at any moment. And so, I mean, I even think about that as like, that took a year of me reflecting and understanding and growing in my relationship to land, to my people, and to Indigenous people, for me to actually understand what that moment was. Like, it took that long. And I carried so much shame about my inability to show up fully in that space. But I say that to say that this work, as Gabby said at the beginning, is lifelong. It takes, you know, it's a constant, you're in a constant mode of reflection, and you're in a constant space of learning and growing. And so I really wanted to point that out. The last thing I'll say, just because also entering into, yeah, just I remember, you know, in deepening my relationships and like Danny and I hanging out a lot together, and the folks at 4Rs. I remember when I first heard of SNRK, Snotty Nose Res Kids, and just thinking like, feeling so, I mean, like, their music is good or whatever, but feeling like there needed to be a bigger conversation around the exploitation of Black culture within Indigenous communities. And so I see so many, you know, I see how hip hop is becoming this thing that's getting bigger and bigger in Indigenous spaces, especially urban spaces. And I also see a lot of really great, you know, Indigenous hip hop and rap artists. But I also like really want us to center in how, in the same ways that erasure is an act of violence, exploitation, and the ways that we've learned to just take from Black culture without thinking of it as something that's like powerful or something that's, you know, beautiful or something that needs to be honored, because it does, right? Like, our culture does, right up until today. Rap culture, you know, hip hop culture is really deeply rooted in you know, roots and the blues, and Negro spirituals. Like, it's really rooted in a deep history that we erase, and that we are socialized to erase because of how much it's lived in American culture, and also how, like, you know, the US has erased this for a very long time as well. And so I also think that a way that we enact violence, you know, to Black communities is in the exploitation of Black culture without that recognition. And I think I remember going to like an SNRK concert, and they like used some like old 2016 like Ebonics and were like rapping over like an old Migos track. And I was like, this is just embarrassing. Like I remember actually just being like, this is not okay. This is not okay. And there needs to be a conversation about Black culture and how deeply it's exploited. And I think there's also this relationship that's developed by, you know, Indigenous kids who grow up in the hood and Black kids who grow up in the hood and are sharing culture. But I think that there's like a need for us to really reflect on what that means and hold Indigenous hip hop artists and rap artists accountable to that. Make sure that they're like, you know, they know that they're profiting off of the labor and the history of a Black art. And, you know, I've noticed that folks have been like posting about BLM right now because it's like the moment too, and it's cool or whatever. But I think that there actually needs to be a way that we center and honor Black culture as something that's really important, important for us to remember that, yeah, we've been socialized to diminish it. And so we need to think about it and honor it in a special way that, you know, might not feel as natural to us or that we've been socialized differently to do. Yeah, and then, I mean, I just think that it's really important to reshare what Shanice said about holding our elders accountable or taking the time to teach elders. I think of that in both contexts. Like I think of how, you know, even right now, there's no way I could be like, Grandma, let's sit down and talk about anti-Indigeneity, but there are comments that she says that I have to like hop on and correct right away. And so I think about how our practice of, when I say spheres of influence, that's like your family, your intimate relationships, your family, your friends, your community, your society, and then the country as a whole, or Turtle Island. And so we have to think about that ripple. And sometimes we don't think it's enough to have those conversations with our family, but it absolutely is. And it's a way that we show that we're committed to their growth and their knowledge. And so I just want to reiterate how valuable and important that is on both ends. And how often we diminish it by way of just supporting folks in our working spaces or in our community spaces, but how it's actually really important that we center in like how difficult it is to have those conversations in intimate relationships, whether that's a partner, a friend, or with family. But that's actually where the most powerful conversations and the most powerful and critical change happen. Yeah, I think that's it for me in terms of what I wanted to share. I'm looking forward to hearing questions and what other folks have to say, and then also hearing Megan talk. But I'm really grateful that A7G has offered us this space, and yeah, thank you.
Mika, Chai Hai, Muna. Yeah, so much really important dialogue happening. And so thank you all for taking the time. I know it's a lot of energy and time. And so I wanted to mention like that idea of decentering whiteness. That was taught to me actually by this amazing Indigenous woman, Chris Archie, on the West Coast. And always like making sure like people know about decentering whiteness. And sometimes people are doing it, but they actually don't know how to articulate it. But it's decentering whiteness. So we didn't put like a time on our guests, because that's also again a part of decentering whiteness. Like sometimes you're just gonna do something and you don't know how long it's gonna take or how short it's gonna be. You're just gonna show up, and you know you'll be there, no matter where it takes you. And so also Nimki Ajibakong, what Muna was mentioning, that's like, if some of you don't know about it, it's just this really awesome land-based camp in Northern Ontario. And so you can look them up. We'll probably share about it on A7G. We're actually planning a trip for a bunch of youth to go down there. About 15 youth signed up to go down, but then COVID happened. So it's been postponed, but we're gonna scrape some hides, like some of the folks on the call tonight. Hunter and Bees. What kind of hides are you guys scraping?
We're scraping deer hides.
Nice.
Hunter dyed their hide with hemlock bark, so it's red, and then mine's just white.
Wow. That's so good. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, and then I wanted to mention before we move on to Megan, who's gonna close us off. I wanted to really mention what you talked about, Muna, and kind of like that idea of like this passive aggressive racism that exists in Canada, and it's just as deadly as aggressive racism. And it's like basically the way I understand it is it's like Trudeau sending in military to remove Indigenous people from their homelands and then getting in a press conference and saying he's been working on systemic racism. Like, it's so harmful and so just as deadly. So we always have to be mindful about words and where people's actions really are. So I'm trying to find Megan. Okay, I found you. I don't know how you got all the way down there. But I'll read Megan's bio. So Megan Willis is a mindfulness coach and an active diversity advocate as chair of nonprofit organization Parents of Diversity. From motherhood to professional roles, she emphasizes the importance of intersectional wellness and social justice. Her passion for inclusion and equity stems from her continued experience as a multiracial Black Canadian woman with pronouns she, her, and a Jamaican heritage. Mindfulness offers practices and tools to empower our self-awareness, self-mastery, and equanimity. Did I say that right? I've actually never seen that word before. Megan believes mindfulness is a pivotal tool for individual healing and equity advocacy, encouraging acceptance and compassion in the face of discomfort. And so the really special story I wanted to share, I have lots of special stories about every one of our guests, but Megan asked me to be on this panel for Canada Day. And I was like, I'm not going to a Canada Day panel. Like that was my first reaction. And then she was like, no, like it's gonna be like people of color, all women, BIPOC women, and we're gonna actually talk about the truth about Canada. And it's not going to be like a tokenizing experience. And so I was like, oh, okay, like I'll try it out. And I went, and it was a really great experience. It was just great to hear all of the synergies and also learn about all the differences amongst women, BIPOC women. And I feel like we really built like really lifelong relationships just on this one panel, you know? But it was decentering whiteness on that panel. It was really centering our shared experiences and values. And so like a week later, Megan emails me and Megan's like, I really need to meet up with you. It's really, really important. I want to give you something. I'm like, okay. So I show up and we meet each other for coffee. And she's like, I have tobacco for you. And I was just like, oh, like it's not money. It has no comparison to money. And Megan told me how she used that tobacco and put many good intentions and good thoughts into that tobacco. And yeah, and literally like that meant the world to me. And yeah, I feel like we've been friends ever since. So without any further ado, Megan, did you want to take it away?
Yes. Thank you, Gabby, for that amazing intro and your perspective on that. If anybody knows Gabby well, she's full of laughter and smiles and not always great storytelling, but I don't always know if I'm doing something impactful or if I'm, I'm in this place like that vulnerability that many of the ladies that were on here speaking of, especially Muna and Sharon, of having these dark places of ignorance towards the Indigenous community and about the Indigenous communities that we are living with day in and day out. And so to hear you say that, I really appreciate that. It was really important for me to do the education on my own and understand what's, oh, hi, Kitty, understand what would have been appropriate to show as a token of gratitude. And that's how I learned about the tobacco. And also you talked about decentering whiteness. So I'm gonna just touch on a couple of the things that I heard because I'm the last one. And then I offer everyone the opportunity to do maybe just a minute or two of breath work as we honor this heaviness that we're all experiencing, as we honor each other's presence and that connectedness that we have through the foundation that we're on, right through the soil, the clay, the bedrock, right down to the center of the earth, and how that grounds all of us right now, and that creates that connectedness despite everything that we're experiencing now. So that's really what I have to offer. She gave my intro, and you can find me online if you want to find out more. But this decentering whiteness piece, I wanted to touch on that a little bit further. And I didn't realize that was the right term. So I'm really glad that everyone on here has taken the time out to explain that in their way. And the concept of time. So the idea that there's no limit on us connecting. I remember when I met Gabby to gift her with the tobacco, she had talked to me. I said, I'm sorry I didn't have this prepared when you came to the panel. And she explained to me the concept of time in the Indigenous communities and how it's not as linear as we may see it. And for those that don't know, I'm multiracial, meaning my mom is white Nova Scotian. And as we know, Nova Scotia has very deep Black roots and white roots. And my dad is Jamaican heritage, who moved here when he was 19. My grandmother was one of the first waves of Jamaican immigrants that were given citizenship here to support different individuals in high roles in political, federal government positions. And so she had an air chief, I believe was his role, that she was catering and doing house cleaning for and so on. And she was able to get my dad up here shortly after. And my dad served as a peacekeeper in the Canadian Armed Forces. He was the only Black gentleman in his, he said a platoon is bigger, so I can't remember exactly what he said, but anyways, I interviewed him. It's on my IGTV, asking him all these questions. So this was back in the 60s, 70s, when he first got here and decided to do that work. And so I grew up in this very confusing identity piece where my mom, talking about decentering whiteness, was my mother biologically, but I lived with white supremacy in a way that was unconscious and unintentional. And so for some Black community members, whiteness was this thing external that they experienced, and they came home to a safe space at home. I didn't have that safe space at home when I was living with my mom, and not from an intentional place, but like this week talking about white guilt, where it's like centuries of what the white community has done to Black and Indigenous, but Black right now, because that's what's getting the media attention. The guilt is now weighing heavy, those hundreds of years, those centuries of it. And my mom was one of those people that's immediately in my life that had a full-on breakdown when I went over there, and she's like, I could have done more, and, you know, and just expressing that deep emotion of guilt. And for the, you know, could have saved me. I'm 37 now. That could have saved me so many years of therapy and other things. But anyways, you know, I appreciated that moment differently because of that blood relation that we have, and the fact that the gratitude I share for having that experience as a multiracial child, of always feeling like you're kind of on the fence with these identity pieces and the impacts that have on our mental health, on my mental health. And so my lens really comes from, even when I'm working with Parents for Diversity and doing community advocacy, is around the mental health piece. And every single one of you, Shanice, Muna, Sharon, touched on mental health impacts yourselves, what you've witnessed in the communities that you are also serving as well. I wanted to touch on those quickly before I offer some breath work. You talked about the Oppression Olympics, Shanice. I wanted to circle back to that statement. From a mental health perspective, this is just from my opinion, it is very hard for the Black communities to come together in sovereignty, to come together in union, when from a mental health perspective, we have been in high stress response, including our nervous system. Look at hypertension in our communities. Look at the health conditions that are in our community, physical health conditions that are in our communities. And you see the science of mindfulness now when you observe how your nervous system and your mental health directly impact your physical health. And we can go back to traditional medicine around this as well, because we know the herbal medicines and we know what the chalice and certain things in the Jamaican culture offer us in these reasonings, as we call it in Jamaica, where you share herbs and allow yourself to get into that meditative state so that you can work through some of those mental health issues and challenges. Back to my point. When you are in a high stress response mode in your nervous system, in your either fight, flight, or freeze expression of it, you're in survival mode. And we need to recognize that connection between the Indigenous communities and the Black communities, but also recognize, even just to share this with the Indigenous communities as well, the Black communities have been in survival mode for so long. Look at our Black men, right? You have some that are more concerned right now about returning to organized crime, and other Black community members that are going, well, why won't they join the movement and the protests? Because they're in self-preservation mode. They're in such a high stress response mode with no tools from a mental health perspective from individuals that look like them, that can speak to those lived experiences, that are even the Royal Ottawa Hospital. They have no Black psychiatrists or psychologists. Last time I was there talking with them, I asked them what research and funding they're putting into specific Black appropriate mental health research for Black men and Black women specific, and they're not doing it. Well, we're doing women, but we're not there yet where we're breaking it down. Okay, but directly speaking to what all of us have talked to, and going back to that Oppression Olympics piece, like the tearing down of our movements, right, comes from where we're at from a mental health perspective. And we are literally, this is the compassion piece, we are literally, all of us, doing the best we can right now. Even if that looks like somebody is tearing down another movement, right? Those individuals that are doing that, when you see that internalized self-hate and self-loathing, right? And back to our elders, right? My dad always used to tell me, careful when you hang around Black people, like there's a lot of drama, there's a lot of this, there's a lot of that, and not intentionally, but recognizing how the centuries of being told we're not human, we don't even deserve the same, what we're fighting for right now, everyone, not just the Black communities, what we're fighting for right now is to be recognized as human beings. How much fuckery is that right there? Excuse my language. We are fighting to be recognized as human beings, plain and simple. And you can see that through the systems, and we can go in all those details, but all the other women, Sharon and Shanice and Muna, have done an incredible job of educating us on those spaces and what that looks like. But that's what we are talking about right now. Right? When we're looking at missing and murdered Indigenous women, are they not afforded the same human being title and rights as anyone else? The dehumanizing of Black and Indigenous individuals, right? The commoditizing of us through slavery or sports, right? When we're looking at this, it is a mental health attack. This is an attack on our mindsets, on our mental health, on our innate need to belong, on our self-worth, on our self-esteem, right? And I couldn't be prouder to be Black because, and I'm not Indigenous, but I can imagine the Indigenous community shares this same sentiment. But let me explain why I say that from a Black perspective. I watch my mom and my cousins on the white side and so on feel this grief, and they have no idea how to navigate. I see other white wellness professionals and yogis and mindfulness individuals, and they have no idea how to navigate that. They're feeling some type of way. And I am so grateful that everything I experienced led me to looking into mental health tools and mindfulness and amplifying people that look like me in these spaces, because I have a certain level of resilience and resilience not in the sense that I don't cry and I'm not human and I don't have breakdowns and I don't experience depression, this idea that Black women are supposed to be extra strong, like those stigmas. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the opportunity that we even have here tonight to be together, to share what we're feeling in an unjudgmental and safe space, and have that collective understanding that this is for our mental health, by us, for us, in this setting, right? And another couple things I wanted to share was the critical self-reflection that Muna talked about earlier. That critical self-reflection, we've been practicing things like mindfulness before it was brought to North America. Whatever we wanted to call it in our communities. My dad's heritage, Indigenous heritage, is from the Maroons. I don't know if anybody's heard of the Maroons in Jamaica. You can look it up. The Maroons, there was 2 tribes or clans. I think it was tribes they called them. I'm just learning about this now. And so they were in St. Thomas, Jamaica. And so if you know anything about St. Thomas, Jamaica, we're known as like Obia people. So like similar to voodoo, but the version in Jamaica. So Black magic is what it was deemed as negatively. But ultimately, the Maroons were able to hide in plain sight from slave owners and had traditional medicines and what would be considered like witchcraft in North America, but really just able to protect ourselves and maintain our heritage and spiritual practices, right? And I didn't know this actually until recently. Someone had said to me, they said, your dad's from St. Thomas. I said, yeah. And I said, we live 5 minutes from Bob Marley Beach. Like, you live 5 minutes from Bob Marley Beach. Behind Bob Marley Beach is this mountain. I didn't know anything about it. And she's like, you're from an ancestral lineage of Maroons. She's like, I knew you were so witchy. Like, I couldn't put my finger on it. So I did some research and I asked my dad, he's like, yeah, man, we're Maroons. We have Maroons in our background. And so it's so important. It was so important for me as a biracial child to have gone back to Jamaica with my dad, not on a resort, to stay in the communities that he grew up in, to see and witness and experience an environment where everybody looked like me, and spoke like my dad and ate food like I ate. And that representation and how impactful that is to all of our communities. And recognizing that we have a lot in common, and removing all of these things that I had just mentioned. And let's just go down to the feeling piece of it, right? The emotional piece of it, the mental health piece of it, our well-being piece of it, right? We may all express grief differently, but everybody that's on this has experienced grief on some level or another. Someone brought up shame, which is there's something wrong with me. Guilt is I did something wrong. We have all experienced shame. We've all experienced otherness. We've all experienced what a sense of belonging feels like or doesn't. And recognizing that when we remove all these layers of identity that have been placed on us, this back to decentering whiteness, right? Recognizing the work that our communities, or even just the foundation that our communities are built on around removing the ego and the certainty that colonialism and organized religion, not knocking anybody who's in organized religion, I'm not talking about spirituality, I'm talking about organized religion, where there is a required need for certainty, and that stems from the ego, that need to own things, that need to focus on the I and the me and the my. How we as Indigenous and Black communities have traditionally been supporting and amplifying community. And so this tonight is just such a strong representation of that, whether we intentionally expected this outcome or not. So that being said, I'm going to just invite you in for some breath work, just for a quick moment, just to honor where we all are right now. Show up as you are, where you are. There's no right or wrong way to do this. But knowing that we deserve this, and knowing that the intention behind this for me is we can get all the government granting, we can get all the scholarships in universities, we can get tons of representation and so on. But to me, those things are amazing. But if we are not offering our youth and our children and our elders and all of our community members the mental health tools to cope with otherness, to cope with the adversities that we are going to face, to give that sense of belonging, to navigate through difficult emotions, to show up for each other when someone is presenting an emotion that may cause discomfort, recognizing that our elders are in survival mode, that other people are, and they get uncomfortable when you cry or share certain emotions, right? If our youth have all those tools but feel like they're not worthy of them, feel like they have no value in this world, believe that they have no value, that psychological attack that is happening towards both of our communities, it's the generation after generation after generation is going to keep perpetuating this suffering. And so moving back to the breath and the gratitude practices that we may look different for all of us culturally, but still is no doubt in my mind something that we have had and will continue to have and continue to share with ourselves and with others. This is from the activism even that we're doing is from a place of love and care. And so if you've ever doubted that, anyone on this call, that's what love and care looks like. Because that's what our future needs. My daughter is relying on everybody here. She's 4. Everybody here is going to make an impact on her future. And I appreciate that. And I appreciate you. And I'm grateful for everybody that's on this call. And I have goosebumps just saying it. And I really, 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 from the bottom of my heart, I mean it. So taking your right hand and placing it over your heart just for a moment. And I invite you just to close your eyes gently. And inhaling in through your nose, full breath in, feeling your chest rise. And exhaling out through your mouth. Gently, lovingly. And inhaling in again through your nose, full breath in. Really expanding your lungs. And gently exhaling out. And as you exhale out, maybe releasing any tension that you feel in your body. Dropping your shoulders down a little bit further. And because your eyes are closed, maybe your senses are heightened in sound and taste and smell. Even in just the physical sensations in your body. And continuing to feel the breath as your hands on your chest over your heart. And just taking a moment to observe the beating of your heart, the rising and the falling of your chest. And allowing your mind to wander and do its thing. And as one thing comes into your awareness, another goes, and just accepting whatever comes up for you. Maybe it's judgment, good, bad, right, wrong. Maybe it's analyzing some of the things you've heard tonight. And as you feel your chest rise and fall with each breath, recognizing any areas in your body that are restful right now. And sharing gratitude for those parts of your body. And sharing that gratitude with your organs as well. That despite differences, despite the things you may hold shame to within yourself, despite any sense of otherness in the external world, any conditional love, conditional friendships and families, your heart, your lungs, your organs have unconditionally supported you your entire life. When you're ugly crying or screaming with joy, they've been there for you just the same without you ever needing to tell them that they are there and they need to function for you. And as your feet are on the ground, supported by the earth, supported by the soil that brings the fruits and the vegetables and feeds so many of us and nourishes us in so many different ways. Sharing gratitude from your organs down to the earth, through the earth, down through the clay and the bedrock to the center of the earth, and feeling that connection of Mother Earth's roots reaching up and holding your feet and letting you know she's always there. And filling your body with gratitude as you inhale and exhaling any sense of otherness, any sense of shame. And knowing that you belong with each inhale and you deserve it and you're worthy of healing and you're worthy of taking a moment of stillness to be present in your body. This is your roots. These roots are always present. And know that wherever you stand right now, I stand with you. We all stand together. And that you are doing the best you can. And repeating after me with your name at the end, just in your head or out loud, whatever feels right. I love you, Megan. I forgive you, Megan. And And just taking a moment to invite that stillness in, to connect with yourself, to feel your spirit, and to accept yourself where you are now. And with your feet on the ground or your body held up by the earth, or the chair that you're on that is held up by the earth, starting to feel that weight again of your body or your feet held up by the surface that you're on. And starting to wiggle your toes and your fingers, and gently, when you're ready, opening your eyes. And maybe you want to smile, maybe you want to cry, maybe you want to scream. Whatever it is that you need, give yourself permission to give it to yourself. Thank you, thank you, thank you, everyone, so much for this opportunity. I appreciate you. And may you be filled with peace in anything that you face throughout the rest of today and this week. Thank you.
Miigwech, Megan. Hi. Yeah, that was really important. We need to take time to do that. Like, I don't know what happened wherever y'all are, but after we like over here, when you told us to kind of open our eyes, there's just like this beautiful bird that started singing. So yeah, I feel like the natural world always gives us signs when we're doing something right. Yeah, I wanted to just echo some of the things that you said. Like, recently I was asked to help with this peer-to-peer support training manual. And it's just like so funny because peer-to-peer support is like a sharing circle. Like peer-to-peer support is like going to almost any Indigenous ceremony. You're always doing peer-to-peer support. But it's just really funny that a lot of white folks need like these 12 page manuals in order to do it. So I'm those things make me really proud to be Indigenous. Those things make me really proud to be able to go to ceremony and understand those things without a 12-page manual. And then I also wanted to echo like what you were saying about how community takes care of community. Like we've always known how to take care of our communities. And there's examples of that, like Bear Clan patrols across Turtle Island. They've been taking care of communities for years now. And so there are already existing community grassroots initiatives that are doing that important work, and I hope that a part of this movement, this revolution is giving back to grassroots. Like, yeah, that's where it all starts, from the ground. But yeah, this was really awesome. I'm so grateful that you all felt safe and open to share such vulnerable parts of you. It was really great. And yeah, like I said, this for me at least, and I believe for like all A7G folks, like this is not just like a one-time event. This is like a lifelong part of who we are. So yeah, I hope that, when we're able to gather again, like, everyone's welcome to come to like a round dance, or everyone's welcome to come out to like community gatherings. And, I hope we can do those like those for me are really important, is like those times where we gather and just have that real like organic knowledge exchange. So that's one thing I'm looking forward to. So I did want to open it up to questions, or just like, even if folks want to share something that they learned tonight, something they're taking away. I don't know if we'll have time to get through all of the participants, unfortunately. But maybe like just like raise your hand or something, and we can do some questions, or I don't like to say comments because comments sound so negative, but words of encouragement, support. Yeah, we'll open it up now. Actually, before I do that, I'm gonna just end our YouTube.